This morning's reading is taken from an article written by Dorothy Day for the April 1964 edition of the Catholic Worker newspaper. However, before considering the reading, I think it's important that I provide some context by giving background information about the Catholic Worker movement. The Catholic Worker is a movement formally formed in 1933 in the midst of the Great Depression. Its founders are Dorothy Day and the lesser-known but equally influential personalist Peter Morin. It arose from and was founded in response to the times in which they both lived. The social foment caused by socialism, the movement for workers' rights, the destruction caused by the First World War, economic disparity, and the outright hunger and destitution of the poor. It was and is unapologetically Christian and Roman Catholic in its founding and its orientation. But its literal interpretation and living out of Christian values caused it often to run up against the power structures of the Church and to be held at arm's length by the hierarchy. Its interpretation of the gospel and its message of compassion was so literal that Dorothy Day and many of the workers maintained a stance of pacifism, even during World War II. The movement has never sought to be a religious order, but even the most cursory examination show that their houses of hospitality are faith communities. The movement is best known for running houses of hospitality in rundown sections of various cities, but it also has run and continues to run small farms as worker communities. Traditionally, these grow food for the houses of hospitality. At the houses of hospitality, food, clothing, welcome, and shelter are extended to those in need by unpaid volunteers according to the ability of each household. Volunteers live in the houses of hospitalities with those who are in need. Catholic worker communities are autonomous. They are known for the active support of labor unions, human rights, cooperatives, and the development of a non-violent culture. At present, there are approximately 245 Catholic worker communities worldwide. The Catholic Worker also is the name of a newspaper published by the New York worker community. Dorothy Day was its editor from 1933 through her death in 1980. In 1933, it sold for 1 penny. It continues to sell for 1 penny, and it will always sell for 1 penny. The worker movement does not engage in fundraising. It does not seek grants or government subsidies. Some of the movement's money comes from outside jobs of their workers and from cottage industries. However, most of it comes from donations. The Catholic worker movement has refused tax-exempt status. Its philosophical and theological sources are broad, deep, and rich, much like Unitarian Universalism. They are drawn both from the ancient philosophical and theological thoughts of the ancient and Middle Ages, and also from the philosophical movements of the early 20th century. These all include the biblical works of mercy, codified in the Middle Ages by Thomas Aquinas as the corporal works of mercy. They are inspired by the Benedictine medieval tradition of hospitality, the Franciscan medieval tradition of voluntary apostolic poverty, by the works of Dostoevsky and of Tolstoy, by the 20th century philosopher Nicholas Berdyaev, and also by the early 20th century philosophies of the French Personalists. The movement uses all of these influences to inspire and explain its direct service to the poor and to the downtrodden as the way of Christian life. An important distinction is that the philosophy is not one of working with the poor, but rather serving the poor. And thus, through its work, the movement seeks to exemplify the virtue of humility. So this is the context of today's reading, which, as I said, is from an article written by Dorothy Day for the Catholic Worker newspaper in April of 1964. And she wrote this in the New York City House of Hospitality. I looked around, and the general appearance of the place was, as usual, homelike, informal, noisy, and comfortably warm on a cold evening. And yet, looked at with the eyes of a visitor, our place must look dingy indeed, filled as it always is with men and women, some children too, of whom bear the unmistakable mark of misery and destitution. Aren't we deceiving ourselves? I'm sure many of them think, in the work that we are doing. What are we accomplishing for them anyway? Or for the world? Or for the common good? Are these people being rehabilitated, is the question we get daily from visitors or from our readers. The majority of them ask the same question. How can you see Christ in these people? And we only say that what we do is an act of faith, constantly repeated. It is an act of love, resulting from an act of faith. It is an act of hope that we can awaken these same acts in their hearts. The mystery of poverty is that by sharing in it, making ourselves poor in giving to others, we increase our knowledge and our belief in love. I find that message powerful because it's written by someone who is living among the poor and understanding that it's not a romantic thing to do. It's a very difficult thing to do. Moving into the message. As I noted, the Catholic worker movement arose from the foment of its time, more specifically from the depersonalization of the individual in the face of what was then referred to as the free market, the fictitious rugged individualism, the fictitious collectivism of communism, the militarization of society, seen then in the rise of fascism. Much of the spiritual call of the worker movement continues to ring true today because that foment has never ended. And indeed, now more than ever, it feels like it will never end. I want to begin this morning by talking about language and its apparent corruption. For it seems to me that as a culture we now are addicted to media and politically driven, rampant hyperbole. Traditionally, hyperbole is defined as an exaggerated statement which is not to be taken literally. Traditionally, the opposite of hyperbole is literally. However, we have come to use hyperbole so frequently that modern dictionaries have come to define the word literally as a word used to indicate hyperbolic expression that should be taken in the strongest sense possible. Thus, in our time, the word literally has come to be defined as hyperbole. In 2015, the late Gwen Ifill of PBS NewsHour expressed concern about the use of mean-spirited and insulting hyperbole in the recently ended presidential campaign. She noted that hyperbole often collapses under its own weight, but then asked, what happens if it doesn't? And it seems to me that this rhetorical question begs the real question of what happens when more hyperbole merely replaces the collapsing hyperbole. And yet it happens again, and the hyperbole collapses. And it happens again, and the hyperbole collapses. News cycle after news cycle after news cycle. We are a consumer society that not only voraciously consumes goods, but we also voraciously that which we call information. With the rise of the internet and the corporatization of media, immense fortunes are made by our consumption of what we call information. But within that context of our consumption, the word information is devolving into hyperbole for an Orwellian-type corporate newspeak. Even a cursory analysis at what our societal discussions have become should give us pause. We have come to the point where it feels that no one pays attention to reasonable criticism or engages in analytical discussion. Our societal discussions feel as if they are hyperbolic reactions to hyperbole. And so it is that language has been cheapened and become merely a commodity which makes money for its handlers, not because it is truthful, but because it is consumable. This frightens me, especially when one considers how important language is and how important rational thought is to us as human beings. In the scholarly work Foundations of Tibetan Buddhism, Angarika Govinda speaks of the importance and indeed the very spiritual basis and the essential symbolism of language. He says, "Words are seals of the mind, results of an infinite series of experiences which reach from an unimaginable, distant past into the present and feel their way to an equally unimaginable, distant future. They are the audible that clings to the inaudible, the forms and potentialities of thought which grow from that which is beyond thought. The birth of language was the birth of humanity. Each word was the sound equivalent of an experience connected with an internal or an external stimulus. A tremendous creative effort was involved in this process, which must have extended over a vast period of time. It is due to this effort that humankind was able to take control of its world. If art can be called the recreation and formal expression of reality through the medium of human experience, then the creation of language can be called the greatest achievement of art. Each word originally was a focus of energies in which the transformation of reality into the vibrations of the human voice, the vital expression of the human soul, took place. Through these vocal creations, humankind discovered a new dimension, a world within itself, opening upon the vista of a higher form of life. I go back to that quote often when I just feel submerged by information and language, that we've really lost a sense of how valuable language is. To me, and I think this quote indicates, that language is the penultimate symbolism through which we all share our human experiences. In The Denial of Death, Ernest Becker maintained that one of Freud's greatest and lasting contributions is the concept of narcissism. That as humans, we are hopelessly absorbed with ourselves. That if we care about anyone, it is usually ourselves first of all. Now, Becker says, and this is true, that this is guileless, and it really seems to come from our animal natures, that organisms seek to protect their own integrity. A pithy expression of narcissism attributed to Aristotle is, luck is when the arrow hits the other guy. Ernest Becker further maintains that a working level of narcissism is inseparable from self-esteem. Our self-esteem, and this goes back to language, our self-esteem feeds on symbols, on an abstract idea of our own worth, on an idea composed of sounds, words, and images. In other words, on language. This means that humankind's natural yearning for organismic activity, that is, the pleasures of incorporation and expansion, can be limitlessly fed in the domain of symbols, and so seemingly into the expanse of immortality. In other words, through symbols and through language, we begin to grasp a sense that there may be some way to live beyond this space and time. Becker posits that through symbols, the single organism can expand into dimensions of worlds and times without moving a physical limb. It can take eternity into itself, even as the organism itself gaspingly dies. From these abstractions and symbolism that is language, arise the basis of what Ralph Waldo Emerson calls heroism. And Emerson maintains that our main task on this planet is to be heroic. So from our guileless narcissism, we create mythical hero systems for ourselves. Systems in which we serve as the hero in order to earn a feeling of primary value, of cosmic specialness, of ultimate usefulness to creation. Our hope and belief is that the things that we create in society are of lasting worth and meaning, that they outlive and outshine our death and our decay, that we and that which we produce count for something beyond our terrifying mortality. But perhaps in our culture, the genuinely heroic seems too big for us. Perhaps we mask our ache to be heroic in the acquisition of things. This ache to be of primary value can also be masked and perhaps even soothed by the hyperbole of which I spoke earlier. This may be what makes hyperbole so rampant in our society and so seductive to us. This use of hyperbole makes us feel as if we are living in times that are cataclysmic and apocalyptic. And by convincing ourselves that we live in such time, we convince ourselves that our lives are uniquely purposeful and meaningful. We can assure ourselves that we are cosmically unique because no one has ever lived through times such as those in which we now live. But now it is important to ask oneself, what if I was able to transcend my need to assure myself of my cosmic uniqueness and purposefulness? What if I could interpret my life experiences in such a way that I can define myself as something other than the centerpiece of my own hero system, my own mythology? What if I genuinely believed about myself that which you genuinely believe about me? That I have inherent worth and dignity as a human, merely being, separate from my hero myth. And what if you genuinely believed about yourself that which I believe about you? That you have inherent dignity and worth simply by the fact that you are a human, merely being, separate from your own hero myth construct. The spiritual problem with a hero myth construct is that we place ourselves at the center of it. We are the subject of our myth, and all events and the persons involved in our myths simply serve the purpose of our myth. We assure, and we thereby assure ourselves a sense of self-esteem and perceived immortality. Thus, within the context of our myth, the others, in quotes, the others in the myth become mere objects by which we perpetuate our myth. Personalism was a philosophical school in France in the early decades of the 20th century. It held itself out as an alternative both to rugged individualism of the capitalist system and to the collectivism of communism. And one of the intellectual lights of personalism was Emmanuel Mounier. To Monier, a person is never an object, but is a subject with a presence to be loved, inspired, and encouraged. He said, "Whenever I treat another person as though he were not present, as an instrument at my disposal, or when I set him down in a list without a right of appeal, in such a case I am behaving towards him as though he were an object, which means, in effect, despairing of him. But if I treat him as a subject, as a presence, which is to recognize that I am unable to define or classify him, that he is inexhaustible, filled with hopes upon which he alone can act, this is to give him credit. To despair of anyone is to make him desperate, whereas the credit that generosity extends regenerates his own confidence." I never have found a more cogent explanation of the first principle of Unitarian Universalism, promoting the inherent worth and dignity of every person. Monier continues, "Love is the one surest certainty that man knows, the one irrefutable, existential cogito. I love, therefore I am. Therefore being is, and life has value, is worth the pain of living. Love does not reassure me simply as a state of being in which I find myself, for it gives me to someone else. What we speak of shakes me out of my self-assurance, my habits, my egocentric torpor. Communication, even when hostile, is the thing that most surely reveals me to myself." When he was asked to distinguish between personalism and existentialism, Monier framed the answer in terms of generosity and self-bestowal at the heart of personalism. He said that the vitality of the personal impulse is to be found neither in self-defense, that is, as in the hero myth system, nor in a life and death struggle, as in existentialism, but rather the vitality of the personal impulse is to be found in generosity or self-bestowal, ultimately giving without measure and without hope of reward. This concept of giving without measure or hope of reward is the genius of the Catholic worker movement. Dorothy Day said in the reading that I shared, "It is an act of faith constantly repeated. It is an act of love resulting from that act of faith. It is an act of hope that we can awaken the same acts in the hearts of others." The worker movement took this concept and underscored that it is an ancient concept. In the Gospel of Matthew, Jesus says to those who feed the hungry, give drink to the thirsty, welcome the stranger, clothe the naked, care for the ill, and visit the imprisoned, that whenever any of these things are done for the least of his brothers and sisters, they are done for him. Thus does Christ come to be personally identified with the poor and the suffering. The scholastic philosopher Thomas Aquinas codified this scripture into the corporal works of mercy. Peter Marall, one of the founders of the Catholic worker movement, often published easy essays. They were called easy essays in the Catholic worker newspapers. He said that these works of mercy are done not only as works of mercy, but also to bear witness to the world of what Christianity itself is supposed to be. In one such easy essay, he said, "In the first centuries of Christianity, the hungry were fed at personal sacrifice. The naked were clothed at personal sacrifice. The homeless were sheltered at personal sacrifice. And because the poor were fed, clothed, and sheltered at personal sacrifice, the pagans used to say about the Christians, see how they love one another. Each week when we gather in community and we take a look at our orders of service, on the back of them are the 7 principles. And each time we gather in community, we affirm and we promote these principles. This is an easy thing to forget in the hubbub of gathering on a Sunday. But it is important to recollect their presence as we gather and to meditate upon them. And as to the first principle, I offer this meditation. The principle, of course, is that we, the member congregations of the Unitarian Universalist Association, covenant to affirm and to promote the inherent worth and dignity of every person. And it is important to ask often, how do I affirm and promote my own inherent worth separate from my own hero myth? How do I affirm and promote the inherent worth and dignity of the person seated next to me, in front of me, behind me, to every person who is here to worship with me? How do I affirm and promote the inherent worth and dignity of the community in which I live each day, to the people who live beyond these walls? And as we consider this, let us recall the words of Dorothy Day, that acknowledging the inherent worth and dignity of each person is an act of faith, constantly repeated. It is an act of love resulting from an act of faith. It is an act of hope that we can awaken these same acts in the hearts of others. So may we make it, and so may it be.
Love, does it fall from skies above? Is it underneath a willow tree that I've been dreaming of? Where is she who I close my eyes to see? Will I ever know the sweet hello that's meant for only me? Who can say where she may hide? Must I travel far and wide till I am beside the someone who I can mean something to? Where is love? Every night I kneel and pray, let tomorrow be the day when I see the face of someone who I can mean something to. Where